The sea around Okinawa lies gray and hard under a sky blown thin by spring storms. The Great Fleet hangs on the horizon like a floating city, a ring of steel called the Fifth Fleet, with carrier decks that breathe fighters and destroyer screens that knit the ocean into guarded lanes. April of 1945. The U.S. Marines have come ashore with the 1st Marine Division and the 6th Marine Division under the 10th Army. The beachheads bite into the coral. Bulldozers chew airfields out of sugar fields. Naval guns draw lines of fire across ridges with names that taste like limestone and smoke. Over all of it stands a strange new arithmetic of life and death. The velocity of a 5-inch shell. The pulse of a Mark 37 director. The whisper inside a small gray can marked VT. The proximity fuse changes the math of air attack, and Japan can feel the change in its bones. Far north of the main body, a thin picket line breathes for the fleet. Radar picket stations sit alone on the map, small numbers on a big sea, each number tied to a destroyer group with a job that no one envies. Station 1, Station 10, Station 14. The names of the ships are Fletcher and Allen M. Sumner and Gearing, hulls with numbers that matter, crews that know this water too well. USS Laffey DD-724.
USS Hugh Hadley DD-774.
USS Evans DD-552. USS Hazelwood DD-531. Out with them are destroyer escorts and picket support craft that do not get songs, but do the work. They stand like doorbells on the edge of the fight. They ring first when the enemy comes. The enemy comes in waves called kikusui, floating chrysanthemum. It is a name chosen with ceremony in staff rooms thick with smoke at Kyushu fields. But the wings that carry the name are patched, tired, and brave to the point of madness. Pilots in white headbands turn toward the sea over Kyushu and look into a future measured in minutes. A pilot slides a hand over the cowling of a Mitsubishi A6M and tells himself that the old Zero still turns inside any American fighter if he holds his nerve. Another straps into a D4Y Judy with a bomb slung under the belly. Engine warmed on a dirt strip where mechanics have done all they can. A third sits in a Key 84 Frank set up for a one-way run and tells himself that the gods will open a road if he points the nose straight. What they all will meet is a wall they did not know existed in this thickness. VT fuse barrages from 5-inch 38 dual-purpose mounts, climbed by Mark 37 directors, fed by Mk-12 and Mk-22 radar eyes, painted onto the sky by CIC talkers who can see through cloud and glare. Dawn of April 6. Kikusui 1. The first mass blow. Fighters from Task Force 58 run CAP over the fleet, Hellcats and Corsairs that will claw at the throat of each inbound group. But the picket line is too far from the deck cycle to lean only on fighters. The picket line must live on its own fire. On Station 1 a destroyer rolls in the swell, antennae turning, SG surface search radar humming, air search weaving a fan. The air control talker calls contacts like beads on a string. Bearing 205, Angels 5, many bogeys. The skipper draws a breath and steadies his voice. He knows the drill. Rudder amidships. Bring the bow toward the threat. Open the range if there is room. Bring all mounts to full ready. VT fuses up. Set the barrage field at 8,000. Mark 37 directors lock, then climb. Out over the sea a group of Zeros drop down to wave height to sneak under the CAP. The pilots see a lone destroyer and feel a spark of triumph. They have caught a thin outpost, a single knife without its gang. They are wrong. The destroyer is a knife, but the knife has a lantern behind it, and the lantern paints a sky no man can slip through whole. The first volley goes up from Mount 51 and Mount 52. 5-inch rounds blow into the air and then bloom in orange puffs where no shell should burst without a direct hit. VT fuses look for a change in the electric field around a moving object. They see a plane the way a bat sees an insect. The burst is not luck. It is a computation in steel and wax and wire, spun by a tiny generator inside each shell, armed by setback and spin. The first Zero flies into a cloud of steel roses and loses its wing in a spray. The second noses up in reflex and takes shards into the intake. The third wobbles, then turns into a smear of smoke and salt. The picket ship has reached out with hands the enemy cannot see, and squeezed. By mid-morning the whole line is lit. One station hears the next fighting and knows it will be their turn in 2 minutes. Laffy stands into a storm on April 16, the day that prints her name into every wardroom. Laffy is a Sumner with men who know the feel of a 5-inch breach as if it is a body part. Suicide planes find her again and again. 22 come in over the course of a fight that lasts an hour and a half. Marine corsairs from the airfields ashore and CAP from the carriers swat many, but not enough to make the sea quiet. Laffy throws VT from every barrel she has, and 40mm guns speak in a chain. A Val peels over and tries to pick the forward mounts. A burst of proximity rounds wanders across its arc and the plane comes apart without a hit that anyone can point to. A Judy tries to low-hop the wake and aim for the fantail. A 5-inch timed at 1,000 yards detonates 800 out and turns the air to hail. Laffy still takes hits that day because mass will always buy some passage. She survives, burned and bent, crew fighting fires with hoses and hands, shells laid on steel deck to cool, the smell of cordite and salt stuck in every tooth. The memory that sits under the scars is this. VT barrages cut the sky into cubes, and the cubes have teeth. On land, the 10th Army pushes south across a jagged belt the men call the Shuri Line. The 1st Marine Division takes one hill, then another with rain turning coral dust into paste. Navy fire control parties talk to destroyers through the roar, and shells step across ridges like a man crosses a river on stones. At night, the Marines dig into mud that smells like limestone and death. They know that the pickets are still out there in the dark taking the first punches so that the anchorage stays open, so that the ammunition barges nose into the reef, so that rations come ashore, so that the wounded fly out on hospital planes at dawn. That knowledge is a quiet rope tied to a man's chest. The rope leads out to Station 10, to Station 14, to ships whose crews sleep in boots and field phones and helmets. April 29. Hazelwood stands her watch. The air search lights up with a small cluster at low altitude. A D4Y and 2 zeros. The gunners bring the forward director onto the low group and the aft director onto the high reserve. VT is set for the lower field. The fire control solution walks a curtain 1,000 yards in front of the nose. The first burst blossoms near the lead Judy. The pilot holds for a heartbeat because holding has worked before with time fuses. This time holding is wrong. The second burst catches him and the canopy vapor turns to glitter and smoke. 1-0 climbs in reflex and meets a third burst at 1,200 yards. The other presses in and dies under 40mm fire at the line. Hazelwood still takes a blow later that day from another attacker that comes blind out of cloud. War is like that. You can shape the odds and never make them perfect. Men live in the gap between perfect and enough. May 11 draws a thick circle around the names Evans and Hadley. Station 10 becomes a storm cell. Hugh W. Hadley and Evans ride the Grey Chop and take on a mass raid from multiple bearings. The sky is a factory line. The CIC talker rides the net like a man walking on a rolling log. Angels 5, Angels 7, new group Angels 3, Vector 170. The directors never stop. The loaders never stop. The 5-inch mount captains are machines with hands. The proximity fuses make the air look like a field on the 4th of July. Burned rings hang and drift. Planes that would have gotten through 6 months earlier now die 50 yards out, and some die 500 yards out and fall in smoking spirals that stain the sea. The 2 picket destroyers shoot down numbers that sound like madness when written after the fight, dozens in shared claims with CAP and with each other. They still pay. Evans and Hadley are wrecked by the end, men killed and burned, decks ripped. But the wave breaks on them, and the wave does not roll past them into the transports. From the Japanese side, the change is a wound to pride and to plan. Pilots who have trained for weeks to aim at the center of a ship now find that there is no clean lane to the center. The air itself seems to explode in front of them in a wall that is never in exactly the same place twice. A veteran who has seen destroyers before and believed in the gap under the guns now finds that the gap is gone. He sees puffs where no burst should be. He hears hail on his canopy where no tracer can be. He feels the plane shudder before there is any visible strike. He shouts inside his own head and pushes the stick down and finds that the sea comes up to meet him with an iron smile. He talks in the ready room the next day if he survived. He says that the Americans have a new magic. He says that the destroyers have learned to make rain fire where they need it. He says that the only way through is to bring 10 where 1 was enough last year. Staff officers in Kyushu listen and frown. They have already planned Kikusui 2 and 3 and 4. They double the numbers. They cut the fuel rations to other units. They take boys who have never flown over water and put them in planes that will never come home. Aboard the picket ships, the men learn a rhythm that keeps terror in a box. The CIC speaks the music. Bearing, range, angels, bogies now bandits. The directors sing back. On, climbing, lost, on again. The gunnery officers set the VT fuses and the time of flight and the elevation and the lead and do it all with a calm that makes rookie watchers think they are made of rock. The loaders make a chain and pass hot shells from magazine to hoist to breech until arms feel like wire. The 20mm mounts watch the horizon line like cats. The 40mm crews talk in numbers that are not words and walk their streams in front of noses automatically. Around them the sea pops with bursts that look too near and are not near. The trick with VT is to forget the sense memory of time fuses. The trick is to trust the unseen work that happens inside the shell when it meets a shape that smells like aluminum and heat. On the carriers inside the ring, flight decks breathe, and the CAP kills far more than the pickets do. That is the truth, and every destroyer man knows it and raises a hand to the fighters that land with holes in their wings and rubber down to the cords. But the pickets know another truth. The CAP cannot be everywhere at once. The picket line buys time and space with steel and blood. VT fuses are part of that bargain, the small advantage that adds up over 100 fights. With VT, a 5-inch battery reaches around a turn. It fills the blind spot that a pilot thinks he can use. It eats the long, shallow approach that a Val needs to get its line. It cuts the steep drop of a Judy into pieces before the bomb can find the deck. It steals a half-second here, a lane there, a decision in a cockpit that takes one breath too long. The math becomes cruel to the attacker. That cruelty saves ships. The 10th Army pushes in the south. Rain soaks the maps in the command posts. The Shuri line bends and bleeds. Army divisions and Marine divisions trade ground and gain feet. Naval gunfire support officers ride jeeps that stink of oil and sit on crates of radio batteries. They call fire from destroyers whose decks are still warm from night fights with planes. The shells come in with that tearing sound that men never forget. The forward observers mark impacts and adjust and keep heads down while snipers stitch the dirt around them. Behind them trucks bring ammunition because the picket line and the carriers have kept the anchorage open. A simple chain. VT bursts in the air. Crates on the beach. Shells in the guns. Ground taken. That chain is the story. A Japanese pilot at Kanoya lines up for takeoff at dawn. He flies an A6M that smells of raw gas and shellac. He does not know if the magnetos will hold for an hour. He does not know if the weather will bite him before the Americans do. He knows that he has a target grid written on a card by his knee. He knows that a petty officer has explained a lane that should be thin between 2 picket stations if he flies where the clouds hang low. He lifts and turns south and sees 3 other planes beside him. He tells himself that he is part of something larger than fuel and air. He climbs to 4,000 and then drops to 2. He runs on compass. He breaks out of a cloud and sees a destroyer. He drops lower without thinking. That is when the first ring blooms in front of him and the plane shudders. He pulls and there is a second ring, then a third. Then there is no more lift in the world. He feels anger rise up like a flame. He had planned to be brave at the end. He had not planned to be blind. The sea takes the plane in a hammer. The last thing that lives in his head is not fear. It is fury that the enemy has taken the very air and wired it against him. On the bridge of a picket ship, the captain watches the fall of shot and thinks in numbers as much as in courage. He thinks in arcs of fire and time of flight. He thinks in the life of a VT battery. He thinks about supply lines because he knows each burst is a shell that had to come over coral and into a magazine and up a hoist. He thinks about the Marines on the south end of the island and about the wounded on the hospital ship that must not be hit. He thinks about his men. He watches the water for swimmers because he knows the enemy will try anything. He watches the sky for the next wave. And when the air clears for 10 minutes, he pours coffee that tastes like smoke and rust, and he stands and breathes, and he does not say anything proud. He just nods to the man at the director and to the CIC talker who has gone hoarse. By late May the rhythm begins to tilt. The Kikusui waves come with less weight. The pickets still fight, but the gaps between flares grow longer. The carriers pound Kyushu fields day after day, and the fields cough fewer planes. The Marines take ground that no one thought would be taken at that speed. The Army divisions bend the line. The rain keeps falling, and the trenches fill, and men still die every hour, but the arc of the fight bends toward quiet. In wardrooms men dare to say the word quiet, but they say it in low voices. They remember April 6 and April 16 and May 11. They remember a morning when the air seemed to crack open like glass under hammer blows. They remember the weight that sat on the chest and lifted only when the last bogey dropped from the scope. They remember the fuse cans stacked like bricks near the magazines, and the way ordnance men guarded them with eyes that dared anyone to waste a single one. From Tokyo, the naval staff write new orders with hands that tremble only a little. They have no answer to the math of radar-guided fire and proximity fuses except numbers and rage. Numbers are running out. Rage is easy to find, but it flies poorly against a sky that explodes before you touch a trigger. Reports come back from Okinawa that read like small funerals. Pilot did not return. A division failed to find a gap. A group was broken up by unknown bursts at a range that makes no sense. The staff tell each other that the men must be braver. The field commanders nod because they have nothing else to offer. The pilots do not read any of this. The pilots fly. The fleet stands watch into June. The picket line tightens and shifts with weather. The names of the stations become part of the speech of the ship the way a hometown becomes part of a man. Station 3. Station 5. Station 14. The men on those ships can draw the sky over each number with their eyes closed. They know where cloud forms by habit. They know where the radar returns are clean and where sea clutter lies like static. They know where the VT barrages work best, and where low angles and spray rob a burst of its bite. They keep those things in their heads and in notebooks in the gunnery officer's safe. They hand them down to the next watch. They hand them down to the next ship that takes the station when they limp off with holes so big a man can see sky through the hull. When the battle is done, the story that fits on a page will talk about divisions and armies and fleets. It will talk about Task Force 58 and the 5th Fleet and the 10th Army and the 1st Marine Division and the 6th Marine Division. It will talk about admirals and generals and maps. The story that lives in the chest will talk about smaller things. It will talk about a Mark 37 director that did not fail when the deck was slick with fuel. It will talk about a VT fuse box opened with hands that shook from fatigue and did not shake when it mattered. It will talk about a CIC talker who kept numbers straight through a storm of voices. It will talk about a loader whose shoulders bled under the straps, who kept passing shells until the last plane fell. It will talk about the smell of cordite and salt and paint and blood. It will talk about a rage that came across the water in white headbands and metal and was met by a new kind of fire that bloomed before it could bite. At Okinawa, the air itself turned against the attackers because of a decision made in factories and labs years before. Engineers in rooms far from the sea built a little brain into a shell. Sailors on decks close to the sea trusted that brain. They trained with it until it was as natural as breathing. They learned distances with new eyes. They taught their hands to dial fields in the sky rather than aim at points. They took a weapon that had been meant for planes a generation ago and taught it a new trick. Then they stood on the thin lines named radar picket stations and dared the enemy to come. The enemy came. The air bloomed. The enemy died mad and angry. Japan was not only shocked in that season. Japan was angry in a way that makes hands clench even in memory. Angry at the unfairness of an air that explodes before you touch a ship. Angry at the way a destroyer can make the sky a minefield. Angry in a way that makes men fly lower and faster and more often, and that kills them faster and more often. When the fleet raised anchor and the lines came in and the ships turned east for rest and refit, men stood on destroyer decks and looked back at the island. Okinawa lay behind them, a smear of green and smoke. The picket crews measured the distance to home in cups of coffee, and in silent meals in mess decks where no one spoke for a while. They did not call themselves heroes. They did not call themselves anything. They cleaned the salt from the britches. They checked every mount and every director and every cable run in CIC. They stacked empty VT fuse cans in neat pyramids near the pier and felt a quiet pride at how tall the pyramids were. They walked off into towns and tried to sleep in beds that did not roll. Some found that the quiet hurt. Some could sleep anywhere. All of them had earned whatever rest they could find. On a beach, a Marine corporal who had held a trench through 3 days of rain looked up at a clear sky and told himself that the air was different now. It was a superstition, but also true at the edges. The air had been shaped by men with tools and math and nerves. It had been tuned to kill. It had kept ships alive that would have died in another year. It had kept ammunition flowing to his line. It had cut the edge off the worst days. He did not know the name Mark 53 or the number on a fuse drawing board back in a lab. He just knew the way the bursts looked in the distance and the way the attacks thinned after the first ring. He took his pack and moved south with his squad and did not bless anyone out loud. He did not need to. The blessing had been paid for, burned into steel, and sent up 100 times over a gray sea. The war rolls on toward an end that no man can see on a clock, only feel in the way the enemy comes later and lighter. The picket ships keep their stations until orders pull them home or send them on. The VT fuse rides out to other seas and other storms. The memory rides with it. In the wardrooms of the U.S. Navy there is a short list of tools that turn nightmares into survivable mornings. Radar picket doctrine is on that list. The Mark 37 director is on that list. The 5-inch 38 mount is on that list. The proximity fuse sits near the top. At Okinawa, the air became a weapon that answered the call before a gun captain even saw a wingtip. That is why the destroyers lived long enough to be scarred. That is why carriers kept flying. That is why Marines kept getting their shells on time. That is why convoys kept coming into kerosene dawns without flames licking at the pier. This is the picture that hangs in the mind after the smoke clears. A thin line of destroyers out in a gray sea. A circle of carriers farther in, decks busy, wakes trailing like chalk lines. A green island under rain. A sky that blooms with orange rings far out, where planes come down like black pins flicked by a giant hand. Radar scopes that whisper ranges. Directors that climb and drop and climb again. Gunners who wipe eyes raw from smoke and do not miss the next setting. A captain who keeps the bow pointed where it must point. Men in ready rooms over Kyushu scowling at maps and swearing that this time they will get through. Men in CICs over salt water swearing softly that they will hold one more minute. The minute holds. Then another. Then another. The wall does not break. That is the heart of it. At Okinawa in 1945, Japan was not only shocked by a new field of fire. Japan was made furious by it. Furious the way a man gets when the world itself seems to cheat. That fury had nowhere to go. It slammed into rings of burst and fell into the sea. The fleet paid in steel and men for every ring, and the price was terrible, but the bargain held. The proximity fuse let the picket line turn air into armor. Armor that bloomed and then vanished. Armor that weighed nothing and saved everything. In a war that asked ordinary men to hold impossible lines, this was a gift. It was science sharpened into salvation. It was one of the reasons that dawn over Okinawa finally came with more ships afloat than sinking, with more planes landing than burning, with more Marines alive to climb the next ridge than dead in the last draw.